Okay, so for grades that are over 100%, that just gets spilled over into whatever wasn't 100%. So like if you need help with math, just send me an email, I'll tell you where you're at. But D2L only goes to 100%. If you do more than 100%, the math works out horribly because it's a very bad spreadsheet. But that's more or less where you're at. So if you have any questions, concerns, curiosities, or what have you, just email away. And then in our parting conversation, I have been asked to speak about a topic that I used to speak about in this class, but decided to focus instead entirely on logic. And that is the category of emotional intelligence, or learning how to navigate through the human discourse by looking at the structures of emotion and what Max Weber would call programs of action. So all languages consist of various structures, whatever language you're dealing with. We are aware of the grammatical structures. Obviously, that's how you arrange the symbols in order to follow the rules, in order to convey the ideas that have been ascribed to those symbols. That you can read about that in Saussure's discourse on language and his theory of signs and signifiers. There's also logical structure, that's what we're dealing with, and logical structure, what we dealt with. And logical structure is mostly like whatever the arrangement of the grammatical symbols happens to be. You can just think of them as casting a net out of your mouth onto reality. And so then all discourse becomes a question of, did I cast the net in a way that you understand and accurately reflects reality? And that's really all we're doing. But then there's emotional structure. It's a complicated one, but I'm going to try to give you just a quick field guide as to how to navigate through easily the most complex thing that you do every single day. And it's not really an exaggeration to call it the most complex thing, because I mean, when you think about human culture, what you have is the most complex mechanism we know of in the universe, your brain, and a room full of them interacting with each other. So that's it. That's as complicated as it's going to get. So with emotional discourse, it's helpful to start off by thinking of it as two categories. And most of these we looked at as far as shift, like shifting the burden or shifting the scope. But in emotions, I think it's helpful to think of it as verbal violence and verbal self-defense. So verbal violence is when you ascribe responsibility to somebody or attributes to somebody without their consent, and verbal self-defense is how you address that. I'll be focusing largely on verbal self-defense. So the difficulty with emotional grammar is, unlike logical structure where you're not really involved in it, or even traditional syntax, it's really challenging to see through emotional structure because it's encoded in what Weber calls programs of actions. You have been conditioned to respond to these various symbols in various ways, literally your entire life. And it's encoded not only into your culture, but also into the very mechanisms with which you acquire whatever goals it is that you're seeking. You cannot acquire a goal without having an emotional connotation to that goal. And therefore there's an entire vocabulary that you are embedded in, both as far as resource management, social and political capital, basically anything that you value. The fact that you value it is going to embed it in this system. Ergo, it's challenging to get out of that. There's a good video of a young lady talking about various methods for looking at discourse from an objective point, emotional discourse from an objective point of view, but given the amount of time that we have, I'll come back to her if we have time at the end. But I'm a horrible role model for this kind of thing, because I find sarcasm and dark wit and crass, let's say, reverse psychology techniques to be just too delicious to ignore. And they do have their place. Satire and wit are very useful tools, but they're not always the best way to neutralize conflict. In fact, I think one of my worst problems is I actually like conflict, which, watch humans interact with each other with the idea of conflict. And look how, you'll quickly notice that there's like two general classes. There's people that know that most people don't like conflict and use that to their advantage. And then there's people that just don't like conflict. So like you're at the restaurant and there's a customer that knows that if they cause conflict, they'll get free stuff. I love those people. Because I'm the one that's like, hey, I won't get fired if I tell you to, and then I proceed to tell them a bunch of things. Or that person that uses the phone in the movie theater, right? Like I'll be like, okay, you can ruin my movie, but I can ruin your movie too. So either we both compromise, or let's get this party started. I used to carry I lived in a really bad neighborhood, and I would carry a bullhorn. So if people were obnoxious in movies, I would just put it in their face. So that's not necessarily the best way to go about doing things. With time, you can learn how to cultivate a language environment in which confrontations can be dealt with quickly, but dealt with dignity, with no sacrifice to your own self-respect or loss of face on the other person's, if you learn how to navigate through these things with these tools. So the 4 basic principles of verbal self-defense. Number 1, learning to recognize when you're under attack. More challenging than it might first seem. Number 2, know what type of attack you're facing. I'm going to be oversimplifying here, but it's a good starting point. Number 3, know how to make your defense fit the attack that you are being subjected to. And then number 4, how to follow through with 1 and 2. So we'll start with the first one. The first step is hard because verbal violence is very difficult to detect. Sometimes it's very forthright, but I'd say 70 to 80% of the time, you're not even going to be aware of the fact that's happening. So for English, one of the most important cues for when verbal violence is occurring is cadence. It's the way people speak, or it's the tune with which they're speaking. I highly, highly recommend going somewhere that when you're in a college, there's a lot of traffic, go to the student commons, and listen to people speak, but don't pay attention to what they're saying. Pay attention only to their cadence. That will tell you almost all you need to know about what the words mean. Not to get too blunt about it, but there's a lot of different language theories as to the origin of language and philology. The one that I find the most sensible is called the theory of monogenesis. The idea that all languages derive from very simple grunts that you can hear when you listen to primates, and that everything else is just an elaboration on those grunts. And if you can learn how to understand the grunts, then all you do is hear multiple variations on that's all we're doing. So learn to listen to conversations that you're not involved in order to practice how to determine cadence. Because when you're actually listening, when the is encoded with something that involves a goal that you're invested in, then you won't hear you'll hear what the little words mean. So practice by listening to people that you aren't invested in, so that you can start to recognize when the goes to You should also try to cultivate a sense of your own emotional landscape. Stop and ask yourself in benign settings like the grocery store or checkout line. What's your own emotional landscape? How do you feel during the discussion, and why? I spend a good portion of my life being very easily bored. I occupy my time by constantly tearing things apart with my mind. So like if there's nothing going on, I'll ask myself how that computer works and keep asking until I know the answer. Or I will look at people's behavior and ask why are they doing that, and keep asking that question until I understand. So try it. Try tearing yourself apart. Try tearing. Do it in benign, boring settings. Or if you'd like an easy warm-up lap, I cannot recommend enough. Go to a playground and watch kids play. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. You'll learn cadence. You'll learn body language. You'll learn base manipulation. What types of lies work, how social capital works. Just sit in a playground and watch. I could do it all day. It's amazing. So try that. And ask yourself, like when you see a child get upset, which you will see every 3 minutes, ask why did they get upset? And then see if you can predict, okay, that person said that, so that means that that's going to happen, that's going to happen, that's going to happen, and she's going to be crying in 3, 2, 1, nailed it, right? It's actually a lot easier than you might first guess. Kids are great that way. So, if you are being attacked and you recognize that you're being attacked, you can start to think of the attacks in 2 very large categories. Attacks about accuracy and attacks about self-worth. 2 totally different topics, but if you're not paying attention, they sound exactly the same. Arguments about accuracy are whether what you're saying is true or false. And if you're providing evidence that challenges somebody's dearly held belief, one thing that might happen is that they will aggressively and emotionally attack that evidence because it makes them angry. If you're not paying attention, all you're going to hear at a very base level is and you're going, whoa. And it's going to color the conversation and might put you in a position that you might not want to be in. And I'm just trying to encourage you to be conscious of this so that you aren't put into that position. But that's one problem. Another problem is if what you're saying is so challenging that it's threatening their worldview, then they might very well attack you. So the more common focus in an argument is for a person to change the topic from the matter at hand, from instead of what you're saying to you just suck. And this takes the form of, in broad strokes, racism or classism, or and what I mean by those terms, racism, classism, etc., just simple definitions. Collective judgment and collective punishment. If I say that I can judge this whole group based off of one interaction and then punish anybody who's in that group simply for being in that group, that's racism, bigotry. Depends on what type of group you're talking about. But it's not uncommon for you to be pushed into this box simply by the facts or the information that you introduced into the conversation. And we learn this largely as ad hominem fallacies, when the shift of the scope of the topic being discussed gets pushed into something completely different, namely your mom or whatever it happens to be.
So like when someone says like you're racist or sexist or whatever, even though you brought up something completely different.
Right. Well, it depends. Again, depends on the case at hand. But like if you said, Donald Trump is racist because blah blah blah. But whatever Donald Trump happened to say actually is historical. Like Donald Trump's racist because he said 2 + 2 = 4, and you said, well, actually 2 + 2 does equal 4. And he said, oh, you're racist too. It's like, okay, now we're shifting the topic.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about 2 + 2 = 4. Yeah. So that would be an example. Anyway, so if you've got your 2 classes of general attacks, attack on accuracy and self-worth. So the first thing to do is determine what type of attack you're dealing with. And this is slightly oversimplified because it can be both, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say it's one or the other. So if it's accurate, first off, concede that you might be wrong. Oh, I'm sorry, I always thought 2 + 2 = 4. But in order to preserve the emotional element of it, point out very quickly, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being ignorant. Because every single one of you, every single one of us, every single human ever is ignorant. That's where we're at. There's nobody who knows everything. And everyone you'll ever meet in your entire life will know something that you don't. And if you can learn how to not fall into the washing machine of emotions, then interactions that reach a point of conflict based off of the accuracy of the information being discussed can be an opportunity for everybody to learn, which is, in my opinion, what it should be. Not always what it will be, but you can turn it back that way if you choose. So we're all ignorant, and the removal of ignorance should be a good thing. So that's a positive tone you can take when the conversation goes that way. If it's self-worth, you can take the moral high ground. What I mean by that is, first off, it's kind of absurd to assess a person in their entirety. You may not agree with me, but wait 5 years and see if you think, I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago, nor will I be the same person in 10 years. That's been my experience this whole ride. So to me, for anyone to try to assess my entire person, especially since, as best as I can tell, I'm halfway through the ride, that's just nonsense. Nobody's in a position to do that. So don't even engage. Don't even play that game. And we'll talk more about how not to play that game. But a helpful aphorism that can not guide you through this is just 3 observations. 1, people who are above you speak up to you. People who are below you speak down to you. And the people with whom you can enjoy a comfortable silence are your equals. So if you are experiencing friction on either end, just pay attention to who's talking to you. And also just remember, absolute claims, period, are kind of absurd. But absolute claims about your personal worth are something that ultimately only you can determine. All right. So all that is way more difficult than I'm making it sound, but you can learn to confront verbal attack without committing verbal violence yourself. In academia, we call this speaking truth to power. That is learning how to navigate through loaded and emotionally charged conversations without stepping on any of the landmines or not allowing the landmines to stop you from where you're going. The 2 key skills involved in this is, number 1, letting go of the idea that if you don't participate in the verbal game, in the verbal abuse, you're letting the person get away with it. That's a bad habit that I've seen in a lot of people. That if somebody's being an annoying squeaky wheel, you might feel obligated to address what they're doing. But it's important to recognize their motivations for squeaking that way. We'll unpack this a little bit more in a moment. But sometimes the best way to win the game is not to play it at all. And the second thing, this is kind of on the other side of that, is learning not to feel ashamed for defending yourself. If someone subjects you to verbal violence, that is, they are unfairly lumping you in a category that is either absurd or that you don't belong in, it's perfectly okay, no matter what the situation is, for you to say that it's not okay for them to do that or to address what's happening. A lot like the people that like confrontation. One of my favorites, so you've got informative language and performative language. We've been looking at both of those, right? Mostly at informative language. But I can say something like 2 + 2 = 4, and you can say, hey, there was no need for you to say that to me that way. And I can hide behind the informative aspect of language, like, hey man, all I'm saying is 2 + 2 = 4. Whilst completely avoiding the responsibility for the way that I said it. There's nothing wrong with calling people out for the way that they said things.
And then they sort of blame you for it.
Yeah.
Saying
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a complicated game to get into, but you have every right to get into that. Yeah. So let's look at some of the people who have contributed to this. Behavioral science, that's my shtick, right? Shows us that people behave in very general patterns that you can learn how to see. And these patterns largely center on action and reaction. And those actions and reactions are almost entirely around goal acquisition. I want the cookie. Or you got the cookie and I wanted it. One of those 2 variations. So these behaviors are cultivated off of very simple notions of reward and punishment. I want the cookie, or I'm mad because you took the cookie. The trick, or the really challenging part, is recognizing that the categories of reward and punishment are not universally applicable. I mean, yes, everybody parses out their emotions and their goal acquisition techniques in terms of reward and punishment, but the trick is realizing that what's a reward to you could be punishment to someone else, and what's punishment to you could be a reward for someone else. That is, yes, everyone is addressing things with this vocabulary, but what that vocabulary refers to can be wildly different depending on the situation and the individual. So let's dive into a little bit of our old boy Freud and just work some of the basic vocabulary for understanding the conversation around how this works. This is not without its retractions. Freud is a very controversial figure. I don't really want to get into the controversy, but basically a lot of his research lacks empirical verification, and that's perfectly legitimate, and that's an important conversation to have. But for the sake of our purposes, let's just look at the basic emotional development from a Freudian point of view. Freud tells us that the human brain is just a blank goal acquisition machine. Eat, sleep, poop. Eat, sleep, poop. That's it. And this young mind is set with innate tools. You call these tools emotion. Happy, sad, scared, whatever. Go watch the movie Inside Out. And these tools are largely centered on self-preservation and goal acquisition. Get out of danger, get the cookie. Those are your two main things. So how that becomes a problem very quickly is, number one, Freud points out, look, if you look at the history of the human race, like, go hang out with your grandparents and just wait for them to say something racist. Right? Okay, they raised your parents. And the people that raised them were even crazier. And the people that raised them were even crazier. And if we go back far enough, they thought the earth was flat. Right? So, the problem is, for Freud, everyone is damaged. And they're raising damaged people. And the damage just shifts according to where you are in history. So, number one, we all lack appropriate models. What I mean by that, or what he means by that, is it's a very efficient way to untangle an emotional problem by simply recognizing that the reason the person is behaving the way that they are is because they may have never seen anybody not behave that way. Putting it in very simple and blunt terms, the person could be an asshole because they don't realize that you don't have to be an asshole. They've been treated like shit their whole life. Also, we lack proper psychological tools. I'll get into that in a moment, but it might be very hard for someone to do something that's very easy for you. But the reason it's very easy for you is because, usually by blind luck, you had good models. I was at Whole Foods the other day. I was buying a bunch of chocolate to sneak in mailboxes of professors that I like. I bought an extra big chocolate bar. The person in the checkout line said, you're getting a lot of chocolate. I'm like, yeah, I am. And then as I paid, I opened up the chocolate bar, broke off half, and said, here, you want some? And they freaked out. Like, it was very awkward for them. They're like, thanks. Yeah. And I was like, oh. I'm one of the first people to do that for you, huh? Like, the world that I grew up in, this was natural, this was open, this was the way that people behaved, and I liked it. And you are uncomfortable because no one did that for you. Have some more chocolate. But but you can't punish people for what you thought was a reward, right? So, no, I just gave her the chocolate and smiled. What happens out here and what happens in here, and that took me a long time to learn. But everyone's blob is going to be a landscape that is a response to whatever their external factors, whatever landscape they found themselves in, is how they're going to grow. So behaviors throughout their life that resulted in goals being met are behaviors that are fortified. We call that enabling. Those are behaviors that are enabled. So the example that I'll probably use for the next 10 years, just because it was so wow, I had a student who wanted to turn in a paper late. I'm sure you can guess what I said. And the student fell on the ground and started crying, like literal tantrum. And I was like, wow, that must have been working for you for quite some time. Because I used that technique when I was like 3 or 4, but it stopped working because I was in an environment where people were like, nope. So I had to change my goals. I had to change my techniques. I didn't have to change my goals, I had to change my techniques. This person never had to change their techniques. Ergo, that, what Freud would call neurotic behavior, was enabled. Behaviors that result in goals being denied will be modified. This is called disabling. So the person that fell on the ground and had a temper tantrum, and I was like, let me know when you're done. That's a disabling move by recognizing the goal acquisition technique that's being employed and not engaging in it. Now, granted, that will probably have to happen many times before they stop that behavior, but it's the start.
So what happened after I fell on the ground?
That was a
Yeah.
college student.
That was like less than a year ago, yeah. Yeah.
What did they do? once
They sat there crying, then they did this thing where they looked up at me and they kept crying. And I just sat there and looked at them. And then when they were done, I was like,
Wow, that's
so,
embarrassing.
Did you let her turn it in?
no,
Why?
because that would have been enabling.
I know.
Okay, so and the behaviors that don't result, the behaviors that are neutral, that is, that either the goal is something that's specific to you, or like if you put little hearts over your eyes whenever you write a word with an I in it, and nobody ever says anything about it, and it doesn't get in the way of anything, that's you. That's your personality. That's who you are. Those are the behaviors that were not either enabled or disabled. So like, if you have a penchant for saying the word penchant and nobody ever calls you on being erudite about it, that's who you're going to be. So this development starts in 3 main stages, just Freud 101. Those 3 stages you probably heard before, id, ego, superego. So recognizing the interaction between these is learning how to navigate someone else's emotional landscape and your own emotional landscape. So the id, ego, superego is usually presented as an iceberg, with the id being under the water in the unconscious, and then some combination of the ego, superego coming through to the conscious mind. Basically, what you got with id, ego, superego is the id is the part of you that's awake, the part of you that knows that you exist. So from birth to grade school, and again, hang out in a playground. The id only knows about itself. So like you're never going to have a 4-year-old stop and go, oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted, go ahead. Never going to happen. Never going to happen. Because they don't even know that you're there. The words are just coming out of their mouth, right? Like, ask kids, like, what do you guys want to do today? And they'll all answer at the same time and in completely different directions. That's pure id. That means that there's a mind there, and it's aware that it's there. But that's about it. The ego is, if the id has been alive long enough and isn't damaged in some way, knows that you have an id too. That is, if you hang out with 7-year-olds, they will, without having anyone explain it to them, start taking turns. Because they'll realize that if we all try to go down the slide together, nobody's going down the slide. So in order for me to get my goals, I have to change my technique. That is, recognize that you have an id too that wants to go down the slide, and we'll all go down the slide one after the other. That's yay.
Shoving people before we see
Yeah,
them.
well, the id will just like an id tactic would be simply just kill everyone and send them away. Then the superego recognizes that people have egos too. So the 12-year-old who allows the 7-year-old to beat them in checkers, that's superego. Because I realize it's good for you, and I get nothing from it. I just do unto you as I would have done unto me. Right? And everyone at different stages on different issues in different circumstances is going to be in different parts of this layout. Yes.
So the superego can be thought of as empathy?
The superego is the part of you that has the capacity for empathy. Because I have to recognize that you exist. I have to recognize that you have wants, and I have to be able to prioritize your wants above mine. So that's a lot. That's a lot to work through. And not a lot of people. The example I normally give for when this goes wrong, when this goes wrong is neurosis. That is, there's some part of your toolbox that never got developed because you didn't get challenged or you weren't in a circumstance in which you had to use that tool. So if I never used my left arm my entire life, it would be like this weird, gimpy little atrophy thing, right? And whenever I tried to use my left arm, somebody's like, here, catch. Ah! You know, like it would hurt, right? Because I haven't used those muscles. It would be very visceral. It's just not morally good or bad. It's just underdeveloped. Okay, translate that to emotions. I hope that all of you experience happiness enough that when you become happy, you don't fall on the ground peeing yourself with glee. Although that's cool, but you know, like just says it kind of gets in the way. However, I'm going to imagine most of you aren't that big of a fan about frustration and do what you can to avoid frustration, and that makes sense. But in avoiding frustration, you're denying yourself the ability to develop the tools necessary to deal with frustration the same way that you deal with happiness. If you ever become a parent, I highly recommend that you develop your sense of frustration, because you will be frustrated a lot. And if you can say, oh, I'm frustrated, as opposed to, I'm frustrated, fall on the ground. Well, if you fall on the ground, that's neurotic. If you can address your emotional landscape or the emotional landscape of others, it's not. So the real problem here is everyone's going to have some kind of gap, some kind of fight between their id, which is, want the cookie, and the superego, I don't need the cookie. And this will be fought through your ego. Your part of you that's aware that you want stuff, and part of you that's aware that other people want stuff, will have to work out the tension. And the way that the ego normally does it is through what's called defense mechanisms.
Anna Freud was the daughter of the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. She was born in Vienna in 1895, when her father's radical theories of sex and the mind were starting to make him famous across Europe. She became a schoolteacher and then a psychoanalyst, and pioneered the treatment of children, establishing clinics and nurseries for children who were war victims, survivors of the Holocaust, or just generally troubled by their lives. Perhaps most importantly for us, she is our finest guide to what we call defense mechanisms, which she described best in her 1936 book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. The book laid out for the first time the core idea that we instinctively try to protect our ego, our acceptable picture of who we are, with a variety of defenses. The problem is that in the act of defending ourselves against pain in the immediate term, we harm our longer-term chances of dealing with reality, and therefore of developing and maturing as a result. Anna Freud highlighted 10 key types of defense mechanisms. Firstly, denial. Denial is when we don't admit there is a problem. We think things like, I enjoy drinking very much, and I sometimes get quite bad hangovers, but I can handle it. If other people try to get us to face up to the problem, we react very badly. The immediate survival mechanism, the short-term instinct to feel all right about oneself, means refusing to recognize our need for change. Projection. In projection, you attribute a bad feeling you have in someone else. For example, you might develop the impression that your partner is going to be extremely critical if you don't make more money this year than last. But in reality, they may be quite understanding and sympathetic. The harsh, bitter thoughts are not in your partner, they're in you, and they came from, let's say, your mother. But you've given the negative feelings, which you don't want to recognize in yourself, to someone else. That's projection. Turning against the self. This is when we think badly of ourselves as a way of escaping from an even worse thought, that someone we hope loves us doesn't actually. Anna Freud learned that children do this a lot. A child abused by a parent will typically seek refuge in a thought which, though grim, is less awful than the alternatives. He or she will think, I must be bad and worthless, that's why my parent is behaving this way towards me. So really the thought goes, I still have a good parent. It's painful to think we're bad and worthless, of course, but for a fragile child especially, it can feel less catastrophic than the alternative, thinking we're in the hands of a parent who doesn't care.
So I classify that one as self-loathing, which is kind of like a reverse ad hominem. So I say, hey man, you didn't turn in your paper on time. And you start going, I'm such a horrible person. It's like, I don't care about your personhood. We're not even talking about your personhood. Your personhood isn't even really a thing. You're just changing the conversation to self-loathing because that changes the topic away from the fact that you didn't do whatever it was you're supposed to do.
Because you're more comfortable talking about
Yourself.
being terrible.
Yeah, or actually, really, you're just happy to talk about yourself because that's something that is interesting to you.
Sublimation. We sublimate when we redirect unacceptable thoughts or emotions, often about sex or violence, into higher and finer channels. Many artists, especially musicians, have used sublimation to turn negative life experiences like drug addiction, social ills, family problems, and so on, into popular and resonant works of art. Sublimation is still a defense mechanism, but it's one of the very best. Regression. Anna Freud believed that when things become tough, we often regress to a way of behaving that we practiced when we were younger. In particular, we do what children typically do, which is evade responsibility. It is for the child always someone else's fault, usually the parents, and they should put it right. In regression, we adopt an infantile sense of our own purity and innocence. The rest of the world is to blame. They should sort it out. For Anna Freud, it's normal for many otherwise perfectly sane adults to go through regressive moments when under pressure. It only becomes a problem when it goes on too long. Rationalization. Rationalization is a smart-sounding excuse for our actions or what happens to us, but it's carefully tailored to get the conclusion we feel we need, that we are innocent, nice, worthy. After being rejected for a job, for example, the defensive rationalizer will say, it was a boring company, or I never wanted the job anyway. They may have very much desired the job, but it can be agonizing and deeply humiliating to admit this to the ego. Intellectualization. Intellectualization is similar. The scarring sense of loss, guilt, betrayal, and anger or breaking up with a partner might be neutralized by thinking a lot about the history of the late Roman Empire or the government's plans to raise interest rates. Many intellectuals are not merely thinking a lot, they are also guilty of intellectualization, which means making sure their researchers keep a range of more pertinent issues at bay.
Absolutely every scholar I know. That's what we do.
Reaction formation. Reaction formation involves doing the opposite of our initial unacceptable feelings. Someone who has a strong interest in the sexuality of teenagers, say, may join a religion with a particular emphasis on abstinence among the young. We're often guilty of reaction formation in childhood. When we're embarrassed about being attracted to a classmate, we might be mean or aggressive towards them instead of admitting that we like them. Discipline.
So reaction formation, that's when you see the conservative politician who makes a career out of bashing homosexuals, who turns out to be a homosexual. That's that.
Displacement. Displacement is the redirection of a usually aggressive desire to a substitute recipient, usually someone who is less threatening or easier to blame. So a classic case is someone who may feel threatened by their boss, comes home and starts shouting at their partner. Fantasy. Fantasy avoids problems by imagining them away or disassociating oneself from reality, from daydreaming to reading literature to looking at porn. We use these moments to transport ourselves from the threatening world to find comfort in an elsewhere.
Read it.
Anna Freud's tone when writing about defense mechanisms is tender and generous. She knows these defenses are quite natural, but she also observes how many difficulties they bring in their wake. They hold back our careers, they're boring for others, and they hurt those who love us. Freud argued that most of us employ at least 5 of her defense mechanisms every day without being in any way aware of it. She wrote her great book as a way of helping us to see a little better what we're constantly doing, in the hope that we can in future be a little more mature and a little less, as we still say, in unknowing tribute to her, defensive towards those around us.
So, try to see the delicate, crazy human animals that we are, for all the beautiful and ugly things that they can do. Best of luck to you. Real pleasure meeting you. Keep on thinking. I wish you a great break.
What do you think?
Yeah, you didn't ride a bike.